I always thought I was careful in the woods. I had been hiking for years since I was a teenager, and I never took dumb risks. I checked the weather, packed more food than I needed, carried extra water, a good knife, and a basic first aid kit. I never pushed myself past my limits, and I always stuck to the marked trails. That last part was important. People who wandered off trail were the ones who got lost, injured, or worse. I didn't want to be one of those people. But sometimes all it takes is one small mistake. This trip was supposed to be simple. Just 2 days alone in the mountains, a solo getaway to clear my head. I had picked a trail in a national forest, a 12-mile loop that climbed up through thick pine forest before opening up into alpine meadows, with a campsite near a lake at the highest point. The plan was to hike in, camp for a night, then take the loop back down the next morning. Nothing crazy. I set out early in the morning, my pack snug against my back, my boots solid on the dirt path. The first few miles were peaceful, the forest quiet except for the occasional rustle of squirrels in the underbrush. The air was cool, fresh with the scent of pine and damp earth. I fell into a rhythm, my boots crunching against the packed dirt, my breathing steady. It was around mile 5 when I saw the side trail. It wasn't on my map. It wasn't marked. Just a thin path, barely wide enough for a single person, breaking off from the main trail and winding into the trees. It looked well-trodden, too clear to be an animal trail, but not maintained like the official paths. I stopped, frowning at it. I should have kept walking. Instead, I pulled out my map, double-checking the area. Nothing. No official trails, no old logging roads. Just solid forest. But the trail was there, and it looked recent, like people had been using it. I hesitated. I wasn't the kind of person who went off-trail, but something about it bothered me. If it was an unofficial path, where did it go? A shortcut? A dead end? My curiosity got the better of me. I stepped off the main trail and onto the narrow path. The first thing I noticed was how quiet it was. The deeper I walked, the more the sounds of the forest seemed to disappear. No wind, no birds, just my footsteps. The path itself twisted through the trees, curving unnaturally, like it was made to disorient someone. I kept going, my stomach tightening for no good reason. 15 minutes passed, then 30. I should have turned around, but I didn't. That was my second mistake. The trail sloped downward, the trees growing closer together, the branches hanging low. Felt wrong. I couldn't explain it, but the further I went, the more uneasy I felt. The air smelled different, like damp rot. The dirt beneath my boots turned soft, almost muddy. My instincts screamed at me to go back, but I had that hiker's stubbornness. I had already come this far. Might as well see where it led. Then I found the cabin. It was old, too old. The wood was dark with age, the roof sagging, the door hanging open just a little. No signs of recent activity, no footprints, no tire tracks, no fire pit. It looked like it had been there for decades, maybe longer. Something was wrong with it. I could feel it. I don't know why I stepped closer. Maybe I wanted to see if anyone had been there recently. Maybe I wanted to prove to myself that I wasn't scared. The air felt thick, humid. I could hear my own breathing, too loud in my ears. The door creaked when I pushed it. Inside, it was worse. The first thing I saw was the chair. Just a single wooden chair, sitting in the center of the room. Nothing else, no furniture, no bed, no stove. Just that chair. And the walls. The walls had scratches on them. Hundreds of them. Deep, uneven gouges, like someone had raked their fingernails across the wood over and over. Some marks were old, faded with time. Others looked fresh. Something moved behind me. I spun around so fast I nearly tripped. But there was nothing there. Just the trees outside, swaying slightly. The light was dim, like the sun had suddenly dipped lower in the sky. I needed to leave. Now, I backed out of the cabin, my pulse hammering. I turned, ready to follow the path back to the main trail. But it wasn't there. The trail was gone. I spun in circles, searching for it. I had just walked in from that direction. There should have been a clear path. But all I saw were trees. Thick, dark trees, pressing closer than before. My breath came in quick, uneven gasps. I wasn't stupid. I knew panic would make things worse. I forced myself to breathe, to think. I had a compass. I had my map. I could get back to the main trail if I stayed calm. I turned west, the direction I had come from. I pushed through the trees, branches scraping against my arms, my legs. I walked for 10 minutes, then 20. Then I saw the cabin again. I stopped dead. My brain refused to understand what I was seeing. I had walked away from it. I had been going in a straight line. And yet there it was. The same sagging roof. The same open door. The same chair, sitting in the middle of the room. I turned and ran. I didn't care about the direction anymore. I just ran, crashing through the underbrush, my breath ragged. I tripped, hit the ground hard, scrambled up, kept going. Then suddenly the trees thinned. I stumbled onto solid ground. The real trail, the marked, official trail. I stood there, gasping, looking around. The sun was higher than before, the air cooler, normal, the way it should be. I didn't stop. I didn't look back. I hiked out of there, faster than I ever had in my life, barely stopping until I reached my car. I never found that trail again. I checked maps, asked other hikers. No one knew about it. No one had ever seen an old cabin in those woods. But I know what I saw, and I know that if I had stayed any longer, I wouldn't have made it back. I had always loved camping. The stillness of the forest, the quiet of the night, the feeling of being alone but not lonely. There was something about it that made the rest of the world feel distant, unimportant. It was supposed to be simple, just a few days alone in the wild, away from everything. I had done it plenty of times before, but this trip was different. It started normally enough. I picked a remote area in a national forest, far from any roads or campsites. I wanted to be alone, away from other people. The drive out there was long, hours of winding roads through dense trees until I reached the trailhead. There were no other cars in the parking lot, which reassured me I had the place to myself. I checked my gear one last time before heading into the woods. My pack was heavy, loaded with everything I'd need. A tent, sleeping bag, extra food, a water filter, a first aid kit, a knife, a map, and a compass. I knew there wouldn't be any cell service, but I had marked my route carefully. I wasn't worried. The first few miles were easy. The trail was narrow but well-worn, cutting through towering trees and thick underbrush. The air smelled fresh, and the only sounds were my footsteps and the occasional rustling of animals in the bushes. I hiked for about 4 hours, deeper and deeper into the woods. The sun started sinking lower, and I found a spot near a small stream to set up camp. It was perfect, flat ground, plenty of firewood, and easy access to water. I set up my tent quickly and gathered wood for a fire. As the sun disappeared behind the trees, I sat by the flames, eating a simple meal and listening to the sounds of the forest. The quiet was peaceful, comforting. That night I slept well. I woke up once to the sound of something moving outside my tent, but it was distant, probably just an animal. I didn't think much of it and fell back asleep. The next morning I decided to explore. I packed a small bag with water, a snack, and my knife, then set off into the woods. There was no real destination. I just wanted to see what was out there. The forest was thick, the trees stretching high, their branches blocking most of the sunlight. I followed a small game trail, pushing through dense underbrush, stepping over fallen logs. It was beautiful, untouched. And then I found something strange. It was an old campsite. The tent was still there, collapsed, covered in leaves and dirt. A rusted pot sat near a fire pit, long cold. A backpack lay torn open, its contents scattered. I stopped. There were no signs of recent activity. No footprints, no fresh firewood. No indication that anyone had been here in a long time. But it didn't look abandoned by choice. It looked like someone had left in a hurry. I took a step closer. There was a boot, half buried in the dirt. Just one. No sign of the other. A cold feeling crept over me. I turned and left, moving quickly, my earlier excitement gone. I made it back to my camp before sunset, but the unease didn't fade. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was nothing. Maybe someone had left in a hurry. Maybe they had an emergency. Maybe. That night I didn't sleep as well. Every little sound made me tense up. The rustling in the bushes, the creak of the trees, the snap of a branch. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up to a different sound. Something was moving, close. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't an animal. It was careful, deliberate. I held my breath, leaves crunching, a slow, steady sound. It was coming from just outside my tent. I lay there, frozen, every muscle in my body tight. Then silence. I stayed like that for what felt like hours, waiting, listening. Nothing. Eventually, exhaustion won. I must have fallen asleep, because when I woke up, the sun was rising. I unzipped the tent and looked outside. Nothing. But then I saw it. The firewood I had stacked was scattered. Not knocked over. Not disturbed by an animal. Scattered. I packed up immediately. I moved fast, retracing my steps back to the trailhead. The forest that had felt peaceful before now felt different. The trees seemed taller, the shadows darker. I kept expecting to hear footsteps behind me, to see movement in the corner of my eye. I never did, but I felt watched the whole way back. When I reached the parking lot, my car was still there. The only car. I threw my pack in the back seat, locked the doors, and started the engine. I didn't stop driving until I was miles away. I don't know who or what was out there with me. I don't want to know. But I do know one thing. I'll never camp alone again. It wasn't supposed to be anything special. A short hike in the woods just to clear my mind. I'd taken this route before, nothing more than a few hours' walk through familiar trails. The kind of thing you do to unwind, not expecting anything to change. But tonight, things felt different. I'd left home around dusk, just as the sun was dipping below the horizon. The woods were still lit by the last rays of light, casting long shadows across the path ahead. The air was cool, with the faint scent of pine and wet earth. I had my backpack with a bottle of water, some snacks, and a flashlight, just in case. I wasn't worried. I'd done this before and knew these woods like the back of my hand. I hadn't planned on staying too long, but as I walked, the beauty of the forest drew me in. The way the trees lined the path, their branches reaching out like a canopy, made it feel like I was walking in a secret world. The chirping of birds had died down, but there were still the occasional rustles in the underbrush, a rabbit or a squirrel, maybe a fox. It was peaceful, almost soothing. The sun set faster than I expected, and soon, the woods were plunged into a thick, inky darkness. I clicked on my flashlight, the beam of light cutting through the shadows, but even with the flashlight, the woods felt oppressive. The trees seemed taller now, and the sounds of the forest seemed to fade away. All I could hear was the crunch of my boots against the dirt and leaves, and my own breathing, steady but a little quicker than usual. I'd planned to reach the creek by nightfall. The sound of water would make for a perfect spot to sit and take a break, but by the time I arrived at the usual clearing near the stream, something felt off. The place seemed quieter than usual, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. I took a step into the clearing, my flashlight casting long, strange shadows over the ground. I stopped and looked around. There was no wind, no sound, just the stillness. For a moment, I wondered if I'd missed something. The creek usually had a certain noise, the trickling of water over rocks, but it was eerily quiet. I glanced at the stream, and sure enough, there was no water. The creek was dry. It wasn't just low, it was completely barren. I walked over to the bank and knelt down to inspect it. The ground was cracked, the dirt parched. No water had flowed through here in days, maybe weeks. I couldn't understand it. There was no logical reason for a creek to dry up like this in the middle of summer. I rubbed the back of my neck, uneasy. This place had always been here, and it had always had water. I stood up, the flashlight trembling slightly in my hand. A rustle came from the trees behind me, just on the edge of the clearing. It wasn't a small noise, like a squirrel. It was deliberate, heavy, as if something larger had moved through the brush. I turned, shining the light in the direction of the noise, but the beam only revealed a few tangled branches and some low bushes. Nothing out of the ordinary. I stood still for a moment, listening. The rustling had stopped. I should have turned back. Something about the woods felt different tonight, and my instinct was screaming at me to leave. But instead, I told myself it was just my imagination. It had to be. There was nothing out here. I couldn't be the only one in these woods. People hiked here all the time. I moved deeper into the forest, following the narrow trail that would eventually lead back to the parking lot. But with every step, the air seemed to thicken. The trees seemed to lean in closer, and the path became less defined. It was as if the forest was swallowing me whole. I should have been able to find my way back by now, but the darkness made everything look unfamiliar. I checked my watch. It wasn't that late, but something was wrong. The woods felt too quiet, too still. My flashlight beam shook as I turned around, checking behind me. But there was nothing. No sounds of animals, no distant rustling, no wind. Just an oppressive silence. I walked faster now, my heart beginning to beat harder in my chest. The trees seemed to be growing closer together, the branches tangled in a way that made it feel like the path was narrowing. It was harder to see even with the flashlight. The beam of light flickered for a second, and when it came back on, the forest had changed. It wasn't the same. The trees seemed more twisted, their bark dark and rough, the branches gnarled like fingers reaching out to grab me. The path ahead was now barely visible. I stopped, my breath catching in my throat. Something wasn't right. The woods had always been dark at night, but this wasn't just darkness. It was something more. I turned around, but there was no sign of the clearing, no sign of the creek. I was deep in the woods now, and the path I had been following had disappeared completely. I felt a cold shiver run down my spine as I realized that I had no idea where I was. My phone was in my backpack, but I hadn't thought to check it. Now, I didn't want to. I could feel it. The woods were alive in a way they hadn't been before. I tried to move forward, but the trees now seemed to block my way. The air felt thick and heavy, pressing in on me. I stepped off the path and into the brush, my boots crunching on the dry leaves, but the ground seemed to give way underneath me. I stumbled, my ankle twisting as I caught myself on a nearby tree. Pain shot up my leg, but I didn't have time to think about it. I had to get out. I pushed forward, my mind racing. I was lost, completely lost. The flashlight was the only thing that kept me from completely losing my bearings, but the beam was weak now, flickering with every step. I didn't know how much longer the batteries would last. Suddenly, I heard it again. A sound from behind me, the rustling, that same deliberate movement through the brush. This time, it was closer, too close. My heart hammered in my chest, and I spun around, shining the flashlight into the darkness. But there was nothing there, just trees, shadows. I froze. A shape moved in the distance just at the edge of the light. It was large, too large to be an animal. I blinked, trying to focus, but the shadows played tricks on my eyes. My throat tightened, and I tried to tell myself it was just the forest, just the wind. But something inside me screamed to run, and so I did. I bolted down the path, my legs aching, my breath coming in sharp gasps. The flashlight flickered again, and for a brief moment, everything went black. I cursed under my breath, desperately tapping the side of the flashlight. It flickered back to life, and I saw it. The figure. It was moving through the trees, following me. It wasn't human. The shape was too tall, too long. Its movement wasn't natural. It glided between the trees, almost as if it was floating. My stomach churned with a wave of nausea. Couldn't breathe. My legs wouldn't move fast enough, and I could hear it gaining on me. I ran, faster than I ever thought possible, my pulse roaring in my ears. My foot caught on a root, and I went sprawling into the dirt. Pain shot through my body, but I didn't stop. I scrambled to my feet and kept going, my only thought to put distance between myself and whatever was following me. It wasn't until I reached the edge of the woods that I stopped. I didn't know how far I had run, but I could see the dim outline of the road ahead. The forest seemed to recede behind me, as though I had crossed some invisible line. The figure was gone, but I could still feel it in the pit of my stomach. I didn't look back. I didn't stop running until I reached the car. And even then, I didn't feel safe. The woods had changed. The trees had closed in on me in a way that was unnatural. Whatever had followed me, whatever it was, I didn't want to know. I drove home, hands shaking on the wheel, and didn't say a word to anyone about what had happened. I couldn't explain it. I couldn't explain the twisted trees, the way the forest seemed alive, or the thing I had felt watching me. All I knew was that I would never go back into those woods. Not ever. I had always been drawn to the quiet of the mountains. Hiking alone gave me a kind of peace I couldn't find anywhere else. No noise, no distractions. Just the sound of my boots on the dirt, the wind in the trees, and the occasional rustle of an animal moving through the underbrush. This trip was supposed to be no different. A 3-day solo hike through a stretch of remote wilderness, a route I had mapped out weeks in advance. It wasn't a well-known trail, and that was the appeal. No crowded campsites, no people. Just me and the land. I parked my truck at the trailhead early in the morning, my pack loaded with everything I'd need: tent, food, water, a map, a compass. The sky was a dull gray, the air cool but not cold. Perfect hiking weather. The first few hours passed easily. The trail climbed steadily, winding through thick pine forests, crossing over small creeks and rocky slopes. The farther I went, the quieter everything became. By midday, I had reached a high ridge with a view that stretched for miles. Rolling hills, dense woods, the peaks of distant mountains. I ate a quick lunch, checked my map, and kept moving. The plan was simple: follow the ridge for a while, then descend into the valley where I'd set up camp for the night. From there, I'd hike deeper into the forest, loop around the base of the mountains, and eventually make my way back. Should have been easy, but sometime in the afternoon, I realized something was wrong. The trail had started to fade. At first, it was subtle, the dirt path narrowing, the grass creeping in. Then it became worse. Fallen branches blocked the way. The ground became uneven, rocks and roots jutting up where they shouldn't have been. I checked my map again, frowning. The trail wasn't supposed to be like this. I pushed on, assuming it was just an overgrown section. Maybe fewer people had hiked this way recently. But the farther I went, the worse it got. Then, all at once, the trail was gone. I stopped, looking around. Nothing but thick trees, endless underbrush. I turned in a slow circle, scanning the forest. I had been following a clear path just minutes ago. There was no reason for it to just disappear. I took a breath, trying to stay calm. I wasn't lost. Not yet. I had my compass, my map. I could backtrack if I needed to. I turned around. The trail behind me was gone, too. That didn't make sense. I had just come from there. But now it was as if the forest had swallowed it up.
No footprints.
No broken branches. No sign that anyone had passed through. A knot formed in my stomach. I pulled out my compass, the needle spinning slightly before settling. I checked the map again, tracing my route. I had been heading west. If I kept moving in that direction, I'd eventually cross a stream marked on the map. I started walking. The forest grew denser, the trees pressing in closer. The ground was rough, sloping downward, forcing me to pick my steps carefully. The silence felt heavier now, as if the woods were listening. Minutes passed, then an hour.
No estream.
No trail, no sign of anything. I stopped, wiping sweat from my forehead. I had been hiking for hours. I should have reached the stream by now. I checked my compass again. The needle was pointing the wrong way. My breath caught in my throat. That wasn't possible. I tapped the compass, shook it slightly. The needle wobbled, then settled, still pointing in the wrong direction. I swallowed hard, my pulse quickening. Something was wrong. I had to get out of here. I turned sharply, deciding to head back the way I had come, even if I couldn't see the trail. I'd retrace my steps, find something familiar. But as I moved, nothing looked right. The trees all looked the same. The ground was uneven, sloping in ways that didn't match what I remembered. It felt like I was walking in circles, but I didn't stop. Then I heard it, a sound, a branch snapping. I froze. It had come from behind me. I turned slowly, scanning the trees. Nothing. The forest was silent again. I stayed still, heart pounding, listening. Another sound, a footstep, not mine. My skin crawled. I wasn't alone. I didn't move, didn't breathe. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, deep in the trees, I saw something. A shape, far away, barely visible through the branches. A figure, motionless, watching. A chill ran through me. I turned and started walking, faster this time, my breath coming in short, sharp gasps. I didn't care where I was going anymore. I just needed to get away. The forest blurred around me as I moved. I stumbled, catching myself against a tree. My legs ached, my throat dry, but I kept going. Minutes passed, an hour. Then I saw something ahead. A structure, a cabin. I hesitated. It was old, weathered. No smoke from a chimney.
No lights.
But it was shelter. I stepped onto the porch, the wood creaking under my weight. The door was slightly open. Pushed it wider, peering inside. Empty. Dust covered everything. A broken chair, a rusted stove, shelves lined with old, empty cans. And something else. Footprints. Not mine. Fresh. My chest tightened. Someone had been here. Recently. I backed away, stepping off the porch. The woods were silent. Then, in the distance, I saw movement. The figure. Closer now. Still watching. I turned and ran. I didn't stop. Not when my lungs burned. Not when my legs screamed for rest. I just ran. Somehow, I found my way back to the real trail. I didn't question it. I just ran. By the time I reached my truck, it was almost dark. I threw my pack into the back, climbed in, and locked the doors. I sat there, breathing hard, staring into the trees. Nothing moved, but I knew I had been followed, and I would never know why. I always preferred solo camping over group trips. I liked the silence, the solitude, the feeling of being completely cut off from the rest of the world. No schedules, no distractions, just me, my gear, and the woods. This trip was no different. I had planned it for months, choosing a remote spot deep in the wilderness of Washington state. It was far from any official campsites, a place I found on an old topo map. A valley nestled between steep ridges, with a river running through the middle. The nearest road was over 10 miles away, and even that was nothing more than an unmaintained Forest Service road. It was exactly the kind of place I liked. Isolated, untouched, quiet. I started the hike early in the morning. The first few miles were on a faint, overgrown trail, but eventually I had to rely on my map and compass to navigate. The forest was thick, dense with towering evergreens and tangled underbrush. The air smelled like pine and damp earth. Birds called out from the trees, and somewhere in the distance, I heard the steady rush of water. By the time I reached the valley, the sun was already dipping low. The river was just as I'd imagined it. Clear, fast-moving, lined with smooth rocks. I found a flat spot on the bank and started setting up camp. First, the tent, then the fire pit. I gathered wood, stacked it neatly, and got a small fire going as the last light faded from the sky. The heat felt good against the evening chill. I cooked a quick meal, ate while staring into the flames, and let my mind settle into the rhythm of the woods. As the fire crackled, I started to get that feeling. The one I always ignored at first. The prickling at the back of my neck. The sense of being watched. It was common when camping alone, just a natural reaction to being so exposed. My brain playing tricks on me, filling the silence with imagined threats. I brushed it off and focused on the fire. The woods around me were quiet, just the occasional rustle of wind through the trees. Nothing unusual. But then I heard something, a soft crunch. Not close, but not far either. Somewhere in the darkness beyond the firelight. A footstep. I froze, my heart hammering. I listened. Silence. Could have been anything. A deer, a raccoon, even just a branch falling. I waited, every muscle tensed. Nothing else moved. Eventually, I let out a slow breath and stood up. I grabbed my flashlight and swept it across the trees. The beam flickered over trunks, branches, undergrowth. Nothing. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling. I stayed up longer than I had planned, letting the fire burn low before finally forcing myself into the tent. I lay there in my sleeping bag, staring at the nylon ceiling, listening. Every sound felt magnified: the river, the wind, the distant call of an owl. I told myself it was just my imagination, that I was alone out here. At some point, exhaustion won. I drifted off. I woke up suddenly. I didn't know why at first, just that something was wrong. I listened. The fire was out, the night deep and black. The river was still rushing, the wind still whispering through the trees. Then I heard it, a sound close to my tent. Soft, careful, a footstep. My body went rigid. I reached for my flashlight with slow, deliberate movements. My fingers wrapped around it, my thumb pressing against the switch. I waited. Another step, closer this time. I clicked the light on. The beam shot through the darkness, illuminating the thin fabric of my tent. Shadows shifted. Something moved just outside. I barely breathed. The shape didn't move for several seconds. Then slowly it backed away. I stayed frozen, listening as the footsteps retreated into the trees. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. As soon as the sky started to lighten, I packed up. My hands were shaking as I rolled up my sleeping bag, shoved my gear into my pack. I wanted to be gone before whoever or whatever was out there came back. As I was taking down my tent, I saw them. Footprints. Not boots. Not animal tracks. Bare feet. They circled my campsite, stopped just outside my tent. I hiked out fast. Didn't stop. Didn't look back. Took me almost the entire day to reach my truck. When I finally saw it, sitting there on the empty dirt road, relief washed over me so hard I almost dropped to my knees. I threw my pack in the back, climbed in, and locked the doors. Then, just as I was about to start the engine, I saw something in the trees. A figure, standing just at the edge of the forest, half hidden in the shadows. Watching. I didn't wait. I started the truck, tore down that road faster than I ever had in my life. I never went back to that valley. I never even told anyone about what happened. But I stopped camping alone after that. I always loved hiking alone. It gave me a sense of control, a break from people, from noise, from the predictable patterns of everyday life. It was the one thing that made me feel completely free. The mountains, the forests, the valleys, they didn't care who I was or what I did for a living. They didn't care about anything. I could just exist out there, moving forward one step at a time. That's why I picked the Valley Trail. It wasn't the most popular route, but it was one I had been meaning to try for a long time. It ran through a deep valley between two mountain ridges, winding through thick forests, crossing small streams, cutting through open meadows. It was supposed to be remote but not dangerous, a place where I could just walk, breathe, and be alone. I packed light, just enough food for the day, a flashlight, an emergency blanket, my knife, and extra water. I had my phone, but I knew there wouldn't be any service. That didn't bother me. I had my GPS watch and a printed map just in case. I had done hikes like this before and I wasn't worried. I parked my car at the small, empty lot near the trailhead and set off early in the morning. The sun was barely up and the air was still cool. The trail started off easy, a well-marked dirt path winding through tall pine trees. Birds were already awake, calling back and forth, and the scent of damp earth filled the air. I felt good, strong. A few miles in, the trail started to change. The trees got thicker, and the ground was uneven, scattered with roots and loose rocks. I had to watch my step. I checked my map. I was making good time. The deeper I went, the quieter it got. The birds weren't as loud anymore. The wind barely moved through the trees. It was the kind of silence that presses against you, making you aware of every step, every breath. I told myself it was just because I was getting deeper into the valley, farther from roads and people. After a while, I reached a small stream cutting across the trail. The water was clear, running over smooth rocks, and I stopped to refill my bottle. I crouched down, letting the cold water run over my hands, enjoying the small break. When I stood up, I had that feeling, like I wasn't alone. I turned slowly, scanning the trees. Nothing, just thick forest, shadows stretching between the trunks. But something felt wrong. I couldn't explain it. It wasn't a sound or a movement, just a shift in the air, like the forest itself was watching me. I shook it off and kept moving. The trail started to disappear. I knew I was still on the right path, the GPS confirmed it, but it wasn't as clear as before. The dirt path turned into patches of grass, then just forest floor covered in pine needles and scattered rocks. I checked my map again. The trail should have been there, but it wasn't. I slowed down, moving carefully, looking for any sign of a path. Flattened grass, broken twigs, anything. That's when I saw the footprints. They weren't mine. They were old, barely visible in the soft dirt. At first, I thought they might belong to another hiker, but they didn't look right. They were deep, heavier than normal footsteps, spaced farther apart. It looked like someone had been running. I felt that pressure in my chest again, that quiet tension. I wasn't sure what bothered me more, the fact that someone else had been out here or the fact that they had been moving fast. I kept going, trying to stay calm, trying to ignore the way my skin felt too tight, but the trail kept fading. The trees seemed closer now, the valley steeper. My GPS was still tracking, but the terrain wasn't matching what I expected. Then I saw something ahead, a piece of blue fabric caught on a low branch. I stopped, staring at it. It was torn, weathered, maybe from a jacket, maybe from a backpack. It had been here a while. I looked around, scanning the trees, the ground, the shadows between the trunks. The silence was heavy. I stepped closer, reaching out to touch the fabric, and that's when I noticed the scratch marks on the tree. Deep, uneven, not from an animal, not from a tool, like someone had dragged their fingers across the bark, over and over. A cold sweat broke across my back. I looked down at the footprints again. They weren't just deep, they were messy, uneven. Whoever made them hadn't been running in a straight line. They had been stumbling. I needed to leave. I turned, moving quickly but carefully, trying to retrace my steps. But the forest looked different now. The trees all looked the same. The shadows stretched long, even though it was still midday. I checked my GPS. It was still working, still tracking me, but the map wasn't making sense. The terrain wasn't matching what I was seeing. Then I heard it. Not an animal, not the wind. A sound that didn't belong. A thud, distant, muffled. Then another. I turned slowly, heart pounding. The forest was still. Nothing moved. Then another sound. Closer. A branch snapping. I walked faster, My legs burned, my breath came quick. I didn't care if I was off trail now. I just needed to get out of that valley. I pushed through branches, climbed over rocks, forced my way uphill. My GPS said I was getting closer to the main trail, but it felt like I was going in circles. Then I saw something ahead, a shape. For a second, I thought it was a person, but it wasn't. A backpack, torn open, half buried in the dirt, covered in leaves. I recognized the color. It matched the fabric from the branch. I didn't stop. I moved faster, almost running now, heart hammering. I didn't care if I tripped, if I fell. I just needed to get out. The noises behind me didn't stop. More branches snapping, more thuds. Not footsteps, not breathing, just movement. I didn't look back. Then suddenly the trees opened up. The trail, right there in front of me. I stumbled onto it, gasping, legs shaking. I turned back once, just for a second. Nothing, just trees, just quiet. I ran the rest of the way back to my car. When I finally reached it, I locked the doors, started the engine, and drove without looking back. When I checked my GPS later, my route didn't make sense. I had been moving in the right direction, but somehow I had gone miles off course. The valley didn't match the map. The backpack, the footprints, the sounds, I don't know what happened out there. I just know I'll never go back. I always camped alone. It wasn't about proving anything to anyone. I just liked it that way. No distractions, no small talk, just me and the woods. It was the one place where I didn't have to think about anything except the next fire, the next meal, the next morning. I had taken dozens of solo trips over the years, but this one was going to be the deepest I had ever gone. I had spent weeks planning it, tracing routes on the map, marking out possible sites. No trails, no roads, just deep forest and the promise of silence. I told myself this would be the trip I remembered for the rest of my life. I wasn't wrong. I left before sunrise, my pack loaded with everything I needed: tent, sleeping bag, food, a hatchet, my rifle. The drive took 4 hours, the last 30 miles on a rough dirt road that felt like it hadn't been maintained in years. When I finally reached the spot where I had to leave my truck, I just sat there for a few minutes, staring at the tree line, feeling the weight of the isolation ahead. I stepped out, adjusted my pack, and started walking. The first few miles were easy. The forest was dense, but the ground was clear, the kind of place where you could feel the silence settle in your bones. The only sounds were my footsteps, the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. By midday, I had covered about 7 miles. I found a clearing near a slow-moving creek, set down my pack, and took a long drink from my canteen. The air smelled like pine and damp earth. The only movement was the water and the occasional bird flitting through the branches. I kept moving. By late afternoon, I had reached the spot I had marked on my map. It was perfect. A small clearing surrounded by thick trees, with a rock face on one side. The kind of place where I could sit with my back against the stone, looking out at the woods, knowing nothing could come at me from behind. I set up my tent near the rock wall, cleared out a fire pit, and gathered enough wood to last the night. As the sun dipped below the trees, I sat by the fire, eating a meal out of a vacuum-sealed bag, watching the flames flicker. That was the last normal moment of the trip. I woke up sometime after midnight, not to a sound, but to the lack of one. The fire had burned down to embers, and the woods were dead silent. No insects, no wind, nothing. Just thick, suffocating stillness. I lay there listening. Then I heard it. A single, soft footstep. Not close, but not far either. Somewhere just beyond the glow of the fire. I reached for my rifle, my heart hammering. I lay there, barely breathing, waiting for another sound. Nothing. Minutes passed. Then, another footstep. Closer. I sat up slowly, gripping the rifle, my eyes scanning the darkness. My fire had burned too low to see far, just enough to cast long shadows between the trees. The eye strained my ears. Silence. After what felt like an hour, I convinced myself it had been an animal. Maybe a deer, curious about the fire. Maybe my mind playing tricks on me. I threw more wood on the fire, watching as the flames flared up, pushing back the dark. Then I saw it. A shape just at the edge of the light. Tall, still, watching. I jerked my rifle up, my hands shaking. My breath came fast, shallow. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, just beyond the trees. I blinked, and it was gone. I sat there for the rest of the night, my back against the rock, my rifle in my lap. Morning came slow. The woods were back to normal. Birds singing, leaves rustling in the wind. It was almost enough to make me doubt what I had seen. Almost. I searched the ground where the figure had been.
No footprints.
No broken branches. Nothing. But I knew what I had seen. I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me, that I was too deep in my own head. But I couldn't shake the feeling. I spent the day gathering wood, walking the area, trying to focus on anything except the lingering unease. By the time the sun started to set, I had convinced myself to stay another night. That was a mistake. I barely slept. Every sound made my pulse jump. Every shift in the wind made me grip my rifle tighter. At some point, exhaustion won. I woke up to the sound of something moving outside my tent. Slow, deliberate. I froze. The zipper on my tent. Moving. Something was outside. Something was trying to get in. I lunged for my rifle, yanked back the bolt. The sound echoed in the silence, and for a moment, everything went still. Then, footsteps, fast, retreating into the trees. I sat there, my pulse slamming in my ears, gripping the rifle so tight my hands ached. I didn't sleep after that. Dawn was slow. I crawled out of my tent, my body stiff with tension. The air was cold, the fire just smoldering coals. Then I saw it. A single handprint on the outside of my tent. Not an animal. Not my imagination. A human handprint. It was time to leave.
I packed fast. No breakfast, no lingering.
I stuffed my gear into my pack, kicked dirt over the fire, and started walking. I moved fast, almost running. The woods felt different now, watching, waiting. Every few minutes, I stopped and listened. Nothing. Then, after a few miles, I saw something that made my stomach turn to ice. A tree, with something carved into the bark. My name. I turned and ran. The rest of the hike was a blur. Just the pounding of my boots, the hammering of my pulse. I didn't stop, didn't look back. I reached my truck just as the sun dipped below the trees. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely get the keys into the ignition. The engine roared to life. Then, in the rearview mirror, a figure, standing at the tree line, watching. I slammed the truck into drive, tore down the dirt road, not stopping, not breathing until I hit pavement. I never went back. I was running a long haul from Montana down to Texas, a good-paying load of steel beams headed for a construction site outside of Dallas. The trip was mostly open highway, cutting through Wyoming, Colorado, and into New Mexico before hitting the long stretch of Texas roads. I had done this route before, knew most of the truck stops along the way, knew which places had the best fuel prices, which rest areas were decent, and which ones to avoid. It was a straight run, nothing complicated. The truck was handling well, my trailer was balanced, and the weight was sitting right on the axles. My only concern was making good time so I could get ahead of a storm system I had been hearing about on the radio. Big rain coming out of the northwest, moving fast, threatening to dump water all the way down into New Mexico. I didn't want to be stuck hauling heavy steel on wet roads, so I planned to push through as far as I could before stopping for the night. I had left early that morning, fueled up outside of Billings, and made it past Cheyenne before sunset. The air was cooling down, the roads mostly empty except for a few other truckers running their own routes. It was one of those stretches of highway where you could drive for hours without seeing much of anything. Just road, dry grass, and the occasional gas station that looked like it hadn't been updated in 30 years. Around 9 at night, I passed a small roadside motel with a diner attached to it. I thought about stopping, maybe grabbing a coffee, but I wasn't tired yet. I figured I'd keep going, maybe make it into Colorado before taking a break. I had plenty of fuel, my logbook was clean, and I was making good time. That was when I saw the first sign. It was one of those old-fashioned wooden signs, half-rotted, sitting just off the highway. The kind of thing you wouldn't notice unless you were looking for it. My headlights caught the faded lettering as I rolled past. I didn't think much of it at first. Plenty of old rest stops along these highways, some maintained, some not. I had used them before when I needed a quick stretch, though I preferred truck stops with other rigs around. Safer that way, but 2 miles wasn't far, and I was starting to feel that ache in my back from sitting too long. I figured I'd pull in, stretch my legs, maybe use the bathroom if it was clean enough. A few minutes later, I saw the turnoff. A narrow road, barely wide enough for a big rig, leading off the highway into the darkness. The sign was old, rusted, barely standing, but the words were still visible. I signaled, eased onto the exit, and followed the road. The pavement turned to gravel almost immediately. My tires crunched over the loose stone as I rolled forward, my headlights cutting through the darkness. There were no lights, no other vehicles, just trees on either side closing in tight. I slowed down. The place should have had at least some lighting. Even the worst rest stops usually had a few old street lamps, maybe a vending machine glowing in the dark. But this place was dead quiet. I kept going. Then I saw it. A small parking lot, cracked pavement, weeds pushing up through the cracks. An old brick building sat at the far end, the kind of structure that might have been nice 40 years ago but had been left to rot. A few picnic tables sat off to the side, their wood warped and splintered.
No lights.
No cars. I pulled into the lot, letting my rig roll to a stop. I kept the engine running. Something felt wrong. I couldn't put my finger on it, but I knew it the second I stopped moving. The way the air felt too still, the way the trees seemed to press in closer than they should. I glanced around, checking my mirrors. Nothing. Just empty space, darkness beyond the reach of my headlights. I was about to put the truck back in gear, forget about stretching, and get back on the highway. Then I noticed something. The bathroom door was open. Not wide open, just cracked. Just enough to see the dark space inside. It hadn't been open when I pulled in. I stared at it for a second, my hands tightening on the wheel. Maybe it was the wind. Maybe it had been open the whole time, and I just hadn't noticed. But I had a feeling, deep in my gut, that I wasn't alone. I put my truck in gear. That was when I saw the footprints. They were faint, barely visible in the gravel. But they were there, leading from the bathroom to where I had stopped. Not away, toward. I didn't think. I didn't hesitate. I hit the gas, my tires kicking up dust as I swung the rig around and aimed for the road. The gravel slid under my tires, the trailer rocking slightly as I forced the truck back onto the exit ramp. I checked my mirrors one last time. The bathroom door was closed. I never saw it move. I never stopped at a rest stop like that again.